wasn't until he turned to see someone in a cell and found the guy with the gift of telepathy. The boy said his name was Satine, and he was a member of a well-known merchant family, but he was kicked out when he messed up, and this forced him to become a thief so he could survive. He continued, saying he had only been surviving through copying others, and it wasn't that he really enjoyed being a thug. So he was really fed up because he'd done terrible things. Luke seemed to understand the guy, so when Satine swore that he'd atone for his sins if Luke would just let him out, it was surprising that he didn't budge because the system said Satine was still rebellious. However, Satine still insisted that he had learned his lesson, but Luke wasn't even moved, and this angered Satine. Satine was already getting pissed because he couldn't focus well with so many voices around him, so he decided he was going to find some information to make Luke weak. Right then, Milia walked in with her nasty thoughts that terrified the heck out of Satine, so he just had to call her out for being nasty. Milia was confused and thought he was being rude, but Grandma calmly explained that Satine had the ability to read people's minds. Immediately, Milia told Granny Nema that Satine was willing to be rehabilitated quickly, so the old lady dragged his wretched buns out of the cell. Just as Milia turned to leave, Luke asked her what she was thinking, but she said there was nothing, only that she was thinking about cleaning toilets, which must have come off as nasty to Satine. Luke bought her silly story, so that was the end of it. Much later, the villagers were all gossiping and Luke realized that something wasn't right, so he went to ask them what had happened and unfortunately found out that the hunting team hadn't arrived yet. This was even more terrifying because they usually arrived at a certain time, but hours had gone by really fast and there was barely any sign of them. Suddenly one villager said it was the curse of a certain Almiraj, which was a giant aggressive rabbit with soft meat. Now Luke felt it could be hard to capture if one did have a gift for hunting, but he did not feel the rabbit had any magical powers. Just then the girl brought out some rabbit's meatballs which she'd been secretly massaging herself with, and she handed them to Luke and Burlet. However, she said they weren't regular balls, and then began narrating a story that started one week when the hunters returned with the giant rabbit as usual. As she stared into its eyes, she felt chills all over her, and even though this animal was supposed to be dead, she could feel it staring right at the balls in her hands. As she drew closer to confirm her fears, the rabbit resurrected and started screaming until it came on her. The girl, after narrating her story, started going crazy and throwing the meatballs at Luke and Burlet, and after, they resumed trying to know what might have happened to the hunters. It was then Burlet realized that they might have gotten some of the wild rabbits sent on themselves and accidentally attracted the animals, meaning they could currently have been surrounded by the creepy rabbits. At that instant, Luke felt a chilly sensation and said they should go and assist the hunters, but suddenly someone from the watchtower alerted them that something was approaching. They climbed the stairs on the wall and saw two shiny balls in the center, which had a striking familiarity with those in the girl's hands. While they were faced with this odd entity, Luke got into defensive mode, and since he was the closest thing to a fighter in the village, he told Burlet to get everyone to safety, and one villager even suggested that they sacrifice the reformed prisoners to the giant twin balls. But suddenly Selin showed up and demanded an explanation for what was going on. Luke turned and was glad to see Selin, while Burlet explained that they had just seen a giant creature and were preparing for an apocalypse. But then the hunting team revealed that they found a couple of giant orcs and hunted them down, and that was probably what had terrified the villagers earlier. In their country, orcs were regarded as delicacies because they were extremely rare and the meat was so sweet everyone would want to eat it out for hours. There were two orcs and the villagers were already drooling for the orc's meat, so Milia and her siblings came with their axes to butcher it. Watching them do the deed with a dead orc, Luke wanted to puke, but after a while, the orc's meat was ready for him to dig into. It looked so delicious that one user even wanted to sell it, but with just one bite, the guy did 1 million backflips. Next, they forced the meat into Luke's mouth, and only one bite was enough to take him to all the continents and back. In his lifetime, Luke had never tasted that good orc, but on the other hand, the rabbit meatball girl looked like the world was crashing down on her. She was just upset that it wasn't the curse of the meatballs as she'd claimed, but just then Milia walked in with steaming hot orcish ball broil. Luke asked why she made it, and she shared that it was a nutritious recipe she occasionally made at the castle because his dad really enjoyed her meatball sauce. Anyway, this was good news for Rabbit Girl who was somewhat excited, and so Milia told everyone to dig into the meal. It was indeed delicious, and the girl was really digging it because the outside was hard and the inside was juicy. What tasted even better was the orc soup, and that virgin was really enjoying her first taste of real orc meat. So far, half a year has passed since Luke created the village, so the villagers started preparing for winter. However, Burlet came with some others, saying that they planned to return to the village for a bit because they were concerned about their aging parents, so about 5 of them would be going. Luke told them they could even bring their parents over to the village, but Burlet, although he was sure the old people wouldn't survive the trip down there. Selin and Barlat offered to escort them, but Luke said he couldn't send the entire hunting team to serve as bouncers. But suddenly some voices chipped in, offering to help. Those voices belonged to the reformed group of guys that no one wanted to hang with, who said they were more than willing to die protecting the others. Luke wasn't sure it was safe to let them out of the village just yet, but Selin said they could come along to serve as extra hands, and if they attempted any form of betrayal, she was enough to beat them up. After that, she bid them goodbye and they did the same. Also, no one was really pleased that those reformed thieves were headed out because they couldn't trust them yet, but Luke seemed to have an idea of what to do. Days after that, Luke made a few more adjustments to his village, which successfully allowed him to create double stone walls in the village, with a space in between serving as a living space for the reformed thieves. He felt that would be enough to make the villagers feel at ease, while the reformed dudes helped to work the fields and do all that. When they saw the space allocated to them, the guys were all thankful, including the telepathy dude. They also promised to be on the lookout for potential threats or dangers, while Satine said he'd communicate any of such via his telepathy technique. When Dogen heard about his gift, he was gushing all over Satine and digging him already. However, he was concerned that the guy had such a gift and still ended up being a thief. Again, Satine had to recount how he was kicked out of his wealthy family. It all started the very day. He was blessed with a gift of telepathy, which was considered a very useless gift. The priest was no priest at all and had the nastiest things running through his mind. So, from the look on the boy's face, he knew that Satine was hearing his nasty thoughts. Now the thing was, Satine actually knew way too much about so many people, like the evil priest who was secretly beating his slaves, an innocent-looking farmer who was poisoning his boss, and a saintly-looking girl who was secretly Mia Khalifa's apprentice. Everyone disliked Satine because they know he'd be hearing their thoughts, and even his parents, whom he loved and trusted so much, had their own secret misgivings about him and felt she was a shame and a disappointment to the family. So they secretly decided to get rid of him since he knew everything they were up to anyway. Afterward, he ran away and found the gang leader, who took him in after realizing the potential Satine's gift had, and the other gang members were equally welcoming. Even after hearing his pitiful story, one of the villagers said Satine had no right to harm others just because he wasn't loved at home, and the boy accepted this. The same villager was about to turn Satine into a laundry boy when Milia walked in cheerfully, announcing to Luke that Berlet and the others were back and all in one piece. But while she was talking so innocently, her nasty thoughts as usual made Satine pass out. Much later, Berlet and Barlat arrived with their old father who recognized Luke as the village head and shared that his sons spoke so much about Luke's goodness, so he came to thank him personally. Another person who returned safely was Grandma Nema's husband, but as soon as he tried touching her, she told him to take his wrinkled hands off her, because all she needed was fresh young men. Luke, on the other hand, was secretly hoping for the safety of the other villagers in Barlat's hometown when he spotted Selen with some young men wearing a familiar uniform. She told him that they were shubs, and to be specific, the remnants of the gang of thieves that they'd caught and reformed. One of the reformed dudes tapped his reformed comrade and told him he'd soon see the light. But that dude was shocked because his friend would never usually speak like that. However, he continued by saying he and the reformies had learned the value of living a just life. While all this was going on, thousands of miles away were a man and his son who were looking battered and defeated by the elements, tired of walking aimlessly in pursuit of a village. The son told his dad there wasn't hope of finding any soon, but the man insisted on going open because they had no better option, since they were out of food and water. At one point, the father was really upset about how terrible things were back in his village, with raised taxes and a terrible harvest. They were out there looking for Luke, but the man's son felt Luke was way too young when he was kicked out and would either be dead or in a different land. With everything looking so bleak, the man's son regretted being born in a useless village, because if he'd left as a young man, he'd have been an adventurer at least, and had a much better life. But his endless whining really pissed his father off, and the man took out all his frustrations on the boy, while pointing out that his son was probably too much of a wimp to have been an adventurer. He also insulted the boy for having no better idea than the one he offered. But while he kept nagging, the boy spotted something in the distance and pointed his dad in the direction. However, the old man felt his boy was trying to change the subject, but the boy insisted that there was a stone wall far ahead. His dad had a blind man's vision, so the boy climbed over a rock to prove that he was really seeing a village. When he peeped in, the villagers all seemed to be living harmoniously, and Luke, Milia, and Selen were taking in just how happy their people looked. Right then, Luke was feeling drowsy, so he went off to bed and fell asleep in his own bed. But the girls later snuck in, snuggled into his bed, and placed him right in the middle of the sandwich. The next morning, Luke suddenly got a message from Satine that two men were approaching the village and were probably refugees. Later on, the man, named Mac, introduced himself as the chief of a southern village and said his son was named Manta. Luke introduced himself as like, the village head, but he secretly wondered if those two were from his village. However, they beat him to it and asked if he was the son of Lord Albert, and Luke was shocked that the man knew him. Even worse, Mac confirmed that he knew Luke was sent away by his father to cultivate a vast wasteland. Out seemed like Luke had been at it for ages, but the boy said it was actually half a year. This made both man and son suspicious because it was essentially impossible to have created such a civilization in half a year, except if Lord Albert had already built the city. Anyway, Luke asked them what brought them, so Mac explained that there was an incoming war, so they were looking for some place to earn money during the winter. Gladly, Luke welcomed them, and they were surprised that he didn't even hesitate. But this made Luke think deeply about the war, and he suspected it must be one of the 5 powerful families who are usually beefing with his own family, and he also wondered if his brother Raoul would be joining the fight. Anyway, Mac and Manta thanked Luke, with Mac saying he wasn't used to such kindles because other nobles abandoned the light of their people. Manta warned his dad to watch his mouth, so Mac apologized for getting carried away. Meanwhile, Luke was deep in thought, wondering about what life would have been like if he'd received the gift of holy swordsmanship. He wondered if he would have noticed the suffering of everyone else around him, because back then he was eager to live up to his father's expectations. Mac and his son decided to head back to the village to give everyone the good news, while Luke said there would be more than enough food for everyone. A couple of days later, the villagers arrived, and Luke welcomed them. Seeing the healthy crops in the village, Mantis said the Dumas about Luke getting a dumb gift were all false, but Luke confirmed that he actually didn't receive the gift of holy showmanship and was ordered to cultivate a wasteland. He also added that he received the gift of village building and wasn't able to use it back at the village, but it was with his current gift that he built this village. Just then the hunters returned and were holding another set of giant rabbits, surprising the new villagers. Selen welcomed them and shared that they were about to have a feast, but Luke wondered why she was boasting when she'd done way more than that before. It was then she pointed them to a great boar, which was part of the hunted meat they returned with, and that was even more of a shocker. Even Luke asked how she took it down, so she said it was a team effort, all thanks to the weapons Luke made for them. This made the hunters also realize that they'd gotten a lot stronger. Anyway, they started dragging the boar and Luke told Mac and the other villagers to wait while the feast would begin shortly. They asked if they could set up a tent, but Luke suddenly remembered that he hadn't set up anything for them. However, Mac told Luke they could handle themselves since they mostly just wanted to earn some money, but before his very own eyes, Luke caused a building to appear from nowhere and they were super duper shocked. Anyway, Luke shared that it was his gift of village building that made it possible, and even though it had some limitations, he could do so much with it. Mac said everyone else might have thought Luke's gift was a useless one, but it turned out to be more useful than their imaginations could create. After all this while, Luke had successfully exceeded 1,000 villagers and was at village level 6, much to his own surprise. It turns out that more people from his village trooped in, and after them, a handful of starved refugees came in asking for help, so Luke welcomed them as usual. He also opened the gates for those who'd simply come to look for money and for those who felt he was running free Airbnbs. Luke felt the recent influx of people may have been because the reformed thieves were always on patrol to prevent travelers from getting harmed, so they might have been a link. Later, Luke and other figureheads discussed on their village was growing by the minute and that they were trending everywhere. Unfortunately, the war was also getting worse and Selen pointed out that they might be the next targets, but she and Milia were equal to the task. Just then it clicked to Luke that gifts were great to have, so if even 10% of the village population had powers, it'd be enough for them. He later assessed them and found that there were about 100 people who had potential gifts of diverse types. Out of these, 19 of them had battle-related gifts, and when word was out, those two slackers were glad they didn't have to work anymore. However, Burlet dragged them from behind to remind them that everyone's effort was needed to keep the village running. Currency in the village didn't provide for many kinds of jobs, so not everyone got their recommended job, but instead got similar jobs to their recommended ones. Luke prayed for things to stay good, but he had concerns, such as people's village loyalty score being very low, and the lower the village loyalty, the higher the chances of leaving the village. One particular guy surprisingly had a low score, but seemed to be getting along with everyone. However, he had more riz than Aaron Pierre, so all the ladies were fighting for him, even though he was married with a child. Eventually, the dude caved into pressure and was about to cheat on his wife when a mysterious hand held his hands in the middle of the night. The hand of justice was none other than Grandma Nemas, who was following an approach to prevent the village loyalty score from dropping further and leading to a depraved society. Sometimes Luke had to personally intervene in some people's affairs to help deal with their problems, but that wore him out. Burlet encouraged him that things would get the village, even though they were currently tense. Anyway, know that the villager population had the 1,000 mark. Luke had the option of building underground tunnels, shops, a castle gate, training grounds, and apartment complexes. From the civilization in memories of his past life, apartments were quite normal, and with more than 20 living spaces, they were more valuable than the roadhouses she was building because everyone would have a bathroom and a toilet. The only problem was that it cost him 300 points to make it. While he was deep in thought about developing the village, the old woman passed by in a somewhat fatigued state, so Luke ran to find out what was wrong. She shared that so far her rehabilitation program had been going well, but there were two of the thieves who weren't budging. One of them was the gang boss, Doriel, to any form of torture. The woman felt he was so used to death and had developed serious guts because of that, but Grandma was ready to take up the challenge over and over again. However, her main problem was the second thief who wouldn't budge and was none other than Bar, the first guy they caught. When they visited him again, he was so pissed and irritated by their little bratty selves. He, however, just called Granny an old hag and reminded her that nothing she'd ever do would make him change. She angrily swore to send him to an early grave, but this seemed to be making him so happy that he made happy noises. Luke was surprised at the sound he was making, but Bar told him to shut up because no one could get him to flinch. However, the old woman didn't let him finish talking and began whipping the hell out of him, but it seemed every single lash was only making him erupt in his pants, and it was as clear as daylight that Bar was into anything that slapped him and gagged him. Will they find a way to crack the cultured fool? And are Luke's parents ever going to learn that their son wasn't the absolute failure they thought he was? If you'd like to find out in part 2, comment, "Choke me, Grandma." Leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video and subscribe to the channel for similar content. As always, thanks for watching.